Okay, so there's another technique I would like to show you guys from Photoshop, and that is how to use patterns. If you have explored the graphic assets folder, you'll see that there are a few things inside the brushes and patterns folder inside the Photoshop one, and I'm going to show you how to load those up now. Previously in other versions of Photoshop, you loaded patterns a different way, so there's a new way to do that, and I'm going to show you how now. In the sidebar here, if you hover over to this area, there should be something called patterns if you're using the same workspace that I'm in. My workspace is it's apparently very custom. I have created my own workspace. So if you're not seeing that pattern show up in a toolbar over here, you can go to Window and then Patterns. To load patterns, you can go into this drop-down menu and go Import Patterns. I'm going to navigate to our Resources folder, into Photoshop, and into this Actions, Brushes, and Patterns. Here you'll see one that's called Arch 515. I've put this together for you guys. Just load that up, and if you drop down, you'll see there's a whole bunch of textures inside. So there's aerial textures of grass, concrete, wood, corten steel, concrete, some paving, etc. So how would we use these patterns on our drawings? If we go back to our section and thinking about this example that I've sketched in, which is supposed to represent a materiality bar, you can use the magic wand to select inside one of these areas. Now, start a new layer and call it F, and then name it after the material you're going to fill it with. So let's say that this one is asphalt because this area corresponds to a road. Now I'm going to actually fill this by going to Edit and then Fill, and I'm just going to use a color. I'm going to set it to whatever, it doesn't really matter because we're going to cover it over. So I'm just going to select some gray color and go OK. It's going to fill this area with a gray color. So I'm going to Control D to deselect that area, and then I'm going to double click here. This brings up the Layer Styles panel, and I showed in the previous video how you could use a color overlay on something, but we can also use a pattern overlay. So as soon as I hit pattern overlay, Photoshop looks for my patterns palette and puts in the first pattern that is in the palette. So if I go down to Arch 515, it's filling it with this grass texture. But if I want to fill it with a different texture, for example, this asphalt texture, then I just select that pattern. So it actually looks like it's scaled pretty well, but if you needed to, you could scale this pattern up or down. And you'll see as you scale it down that you begin to see some repetition and it doesn't look quite right. So try to keep it to a scale that makes sense for your drawing. You can also change the angle. In this one, you see how if you have this preview palette checked off, you'll see how the angle shifts depending on where you put it. You can always go snap to origin, which sets the pattern to its original orientation. So using these sliders and these other options, you can have control over how this pattern shows up. Let's say I don't want this to be quite as full on as it is when it's at 100%. You can reduce the opacity. You can also change the blend mode, just like you can with the other colors. So if for some reason you wanted to blend this into the previous color, you could do that. I'm just going to leave mine at normal and 100%. And then you can keep filling in these boxes with different patterns to create your sort of texture bar graph. But what if we wanted to create our own pattern? How could we do that? How do you actually make a pattern? I'm going to go back into our Resources folder and go into Photoshop and then go to Vegetation and select something from the Aerial Plan View Vegetations. So let's say I have cropland and I want to make a pattern of this crop. I can drag this into my Photoshop, and then to create a pattern, I'm going to press Control A. This is going to select everything on the layer, and you can go to Edit, Define Pattern. And this is going to create a little pattern tile for you. So I'm just going to call it farmland crops and go OK. And if I go over here into my layers, you can see that it is now outside of the folder. It's outside of all of the rest of the things that we have. But I can drag this into one of my folders if I want to keep it as part of my collection. So I'll drag it into there. And now if I go back to my section, select the next box on your section, create a new layer, call it F Cropland, fill it with any color, deselect using Control D, and then double click and go to Pattern Overlay. Now you can go into your patterns and your new pattern shows up right there. So with this one, we have it on an angle, and I'm going to change it back to 90. And then I'm going to play with this scale a little bit so that it makes sense for the site. So maybe I'm going to put it down like that. And I'm going to reduce the opacity slightly here. Now, crazy thing is you can begin to layer up on these layer styles. So if you also wanted to give it a color overlay, for example, let's say that in real life, the color of your crops is closer to a yellowy gold color. So I'm going to choose a yellowy gold. I'm going to turn up the opacity here, and I'm going to see if one of these other colors works well. So I'm going to put it on blend mode color, and maybe I'm just going to reduce this a little bit. And then I can also change the color of my pattern. So using patterns and using layer styles to adjust those patterns is a really great way to start filling in these material graphs.